And now then, finally, welcome to the webinar on our topic on how to lead with foresight. Well, my name is Panu Kause. I'm the CEO at FIBRES Online, and I will be sort of hosting the session today. I'll soon introduce Steve, the man of the hour. The focus of the webinar today is basically more or less with one main topic only, and this is how to achieve a foresight mindset, so to speak, in an organization for even higher impact of your foresight work. And we will address this by talking about three sort of interrelated topics. First, why has foresight become such an essential leadership skill? Underlining the leadership skill point of view here as well. And then what type of a mindset then a leader or an organization should really adopt for best impact. And then thirdly, to take things even into a more pragmatic point of view as well, is that a question of how should foresight then be connected with action. And Steve has some major examples and points of view, especially in connecting or using foresight as part of change programs. That's more or less the questions we will be addressing. And now, finally, with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Steve Wells.
Good morning, Panu.
Steve has ran an extensive career in multiple roles of business development, strategy development, and whatnot at the major pharmaceutical company Pfizer. But for the past 10 or I think, Steve, close to 15 years now, you've been working as an independent consultant and advising really big global clients on megatrends, on disruptive technologies, new models of leadership, and so on. And I know you specifically hold a particular focus on those adopting new mindsets, so to speak, new models of leadership, indeed, collaboration, innovation related to those changing business landscapes. And so with that, welcome so much, Steve.
Thanks very much for that welcome, Panu, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Indeed, that's a good note. You know, we do have people coming in from across the globe, indeed. Now, to get things going, in our previous webinar, we discussed the best practices for really organizing for foresight in a corporate setting, and one of the points of your key takeaways was that one of the very first things you'd need to make sure when starting to really organize for foresight is to ensure key stakeholder buy-in. In other words, at least the key people really need to accept the fact that systematically working with foresight indeed is a crucial thing. But then again, Steve, now you talk a lot about this foresight mindset and foresight as a skill set. So ultimately, the question then is, in your mind, Steve, what does a foresight mindset really include?
Well, for me, I think the first port of call is really an understanding of the tension between exploring the immediate future and thinking about the long-term future. And I think the leadership challenge here is about balancing our resource investment, predominantly time, between three time horizons. And I think successful organizations work on these in parallel. The first is about operational excellence in the current year, kind of winning the race for this year. Because if we're not here in 13, 14 months' time, then there's no future to plan for. The second is about focusing on our strategic planning, looking for growth in the near to midterm. And the fourth is understanding the future drivers. And this is really where foresight kicks in, I think. So what does the world look like in 5, 10 years into the future? But critically, the leadership challenge is finding the right balance of time, of resource across all those three different time horizons. I think it's really important for us as foresight practitioners to take a leadership role in making the change within the organization about how we deploy foresight, focusing on the right business areas, focusing on the right reason at the right time. The right foresight question is critically important. But also, I think, so is engaging colleagues in the right way and encouraging them to be open to creative challenge. I think those are really critical things for future success in foresight. And, you know, all of us on this call, I'm sure, certainly buy into the idea of exponential change and how exponential change across social, technological, environmental, economic, and political domains is kind of racing away. But then when you dial in the impact, the accelerating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, then all of a sudden we get a really good sense, I think, about how rapidly our world is changing and how disruptive features can really change our world. So that starts to create, I think, a really good case for change. But I suppose there's a question here of, so what about all that? Yes, the world is changing. I think actually that sets up a fairly binary choice for us in our organizations. And it's a choice whether to stick or twist with our thinking and our mindset. So stick is actually about playing by the rules of the game that we're used to playing, making sure that if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always got. The danger here, though, is that the world moves on and leaves us behind. So the twist option is creating new rules, creating new games, because unless we do change, we risk becoming irrelevant. And it was Einstein that said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So the challenge here is, how do we change the organizational mindset to truly embrace the future? And there are two really obvious examples of when it goes wrong drastically. And the two I always use are Kodak, inventing the digital camera, then hiding it from the world because it might cannibalize our film business. And the second is Blockbuster, ignoring the potential of the internet to support streaming service, but also turning down a partnership offer from Netflix, who were much smaller at the time, but had a sense of where the future might go. And I think one of the things that happens is that we see lots of organizations like that haven't kept abreast of how the future is changing, haven't used foresight to change their business model to look really critically at how the future is emerging. And there's a really interesting McKinsey study that looked at the average lifespan of companies listed in the Standard & Poor's 500. And the average lifespan of a corporation in 1958, I know it's a long time ago, but the point is, it was 61 years. The average lifespan of a corporation in 1958 was 61 years. Today, it's less than 18 years. There has to be a reason why corporations grow, mature, then die. McKinsey also predict that by 2027, 75% of companies currently quoted on the S&P 500 will have disappeared. So I think that a future-ready mindset is about survival as much as it is about growth. And the challenge here, I think, is embedding an ability and willingness to challenge and change the organizational DNA, to adapt and adopt a future-fit mindset. And I think leadership is the thing that needs to change. Leadership needs to include foresight, to consider the concept of change, and especially organizational change, in the overall landscape that we see in the way that the future is evolving. So I think there's some context for this. I think there's a place that we can go to kind of reinforce this issue of change and the challenge that represents, the change that represents for leadership. And I think we're actually entering a world that requires extraordinary leadership. And the reason for that is this. In the past, we've been confident about how the future might play out. And actually, because of that, we've been able to reach consensus about how to proceed. In my language, that's the realm of ordinary leadership. It's actually the realm of tame problems. But that world is clashing with another increasingly less certain world. So we're uncertain about the future. It's really complex. We have no idea really how the future is going to play out. And because of that, it's much harder to reach consensus about the way ahead. So this is the realm of extraordinary leadership. It's the realm of wicked problems. And I think it's this realm of extraordinary leadership that foresight plays a really significant role. So if I take it down one more level and ask, what are the relevant leadership skills critical to helping us take our organizations forward in an increasingly turbulent future? And hopefully we've all learned that over the last 12, 18 months. And I think the kind of all-encompassing skill capability is about an ability to facilitate development of organizational culture that builds mindsets and capability so that we can imagine and experiment our way to the future. And I think that's enabled by things like accelerated learning, entrepreneurship, systems thinking, creative thinking, a tolerance of uncertainty, contextual sense making, and scenario thinking and foresight.
Oh, indeed, that's a remarkable, say, painting the picture. And there's one phrasing that I particularly like is that your phrasing of wicked problems that so well underline the complexity, the insecurities that we've got, related to, say, potential futures of our business environment, that really grasps the thing, so to speak. But then again, one additional point. Starting your elaboration there, you pinpointed to those different planning horizons, the 3 horizons framework, so to speak, and different mindsets also related to each different planning horizon. Any more details or thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I think these 3 time horizons are really important, because I think successful organizations have this way of future-proofing themselves by working across these 3 time horizons in parallel. So if I go down in a little bit more detail in what I was talking about a little earlier. So the first time frame that I mentioned was this operational excellence. That's about winning the race for the current year. And, as a futurist, I completely understand why our organizations need to do that. And that's really about what's going on right now, what's going on this year. It's around tactical implementation and monitoring, understanding the tactics that we employ to meet our commitments to our stakeholders, constantly monitoring both the outside world and our performance within it to understand how our organization is evolving. It's looking at the evolving marketplace, including near-term trends. So it's really making sense of the dynamic nature of the marketplace right now. The second one is this, where we kind of typically take a bit of a step back once a year and we look for growth. We search for growth. That's exploring the near and the midterm future, perhaps 1, 3, maybe 5 years into the future. And typically this is our strategic planning. But I think one of the things a lot of organizations do is they tend to extrapolate from the past. And I think that gives us a direction of travel. But I think there's also an inherent danger in doing that, because we're reinforcing whatever biases we've seen in the data from the past into the future. Now, that's not to say, obviously, that that's not a valuable exercise, because that will help us think about new market opportunities, consider risks based on the trends. It helps us forecast, and it gives us organizational confidence about the direction of travel. And I think this idea of confidence and uncertainty and the tension between the two is something I'll come back to a little bit later on as well, because I think that's really, really important. Then the third time horizon, we're making sense of future drivers. We're looking into the longer term future to explore possibilities, new ideas, developments, weak signals, and wildcards. So we're probably 4, 5, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years even into the future. Now, we know the further we go out into the future, the more uncertainty there is. But this is where foresight and particularly scenarios come into play, because it's our processes, our robust processes, that help give people a confidence to look into the future, that we're not trying to develop some kind of fiction. We also have to realize, and we have to, develop a sense within the organization that foresight isn't about being right. It's about painting possible, plausible future scenarios to help us develop insight about what may emerge, as opposed to trying to be right about a given path. So being right or wrong about the future misses the point. This is as much about developing our capability, competence around uncertainty, as it is about being right about the future.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. Indeed, the three horizons framework, so to speak. I've personally found that pretty valuable. Also, back in my corporate career, then as a consultant, and obviously today also with quite a few customers, then working, if not exactly in that manner, but still, with those different mindsets and also some different ways of organizing for their, focuses and resources on those different horizons. Any practical examples from you, Steve?
Yeah, there's one in particular that comes to mind that I think ties together a number of the things that I've been speaking about already. So the organization is the UK affiliate of a multinational, of a global multinational company. Now, the UK affiliate was operationally really good. I mean, it was a very successful organization. There was great tactical awareness of the market trends, constant monitoring of what was happening in the marketplace and the organization's impact on the marketplace. The strategic planning process, as I just described looking at the three horizons, is where the company ran its search for growth. Now, both at the operational and the strategic planning level, the focus was very much at the brand level. And forecasts were generally based on sophisticated, perhaps, but still extrapolation of past data. There was some attempt to factor in potential opportunities and risks and try to measure the potential impact of those. But again, everything was at the brand level. Everything was at the focused at the product level. What was missing, though, was an in-depth assessment of the future macro environment, actually taking a step back, taking ourselves above the horizon to look at the broader environment, how the wider marketplace was evolving, the political, economic, social, and technological drivers that were likely to have an impact on the whole of the marketplace and not just the marketplace specific to those brands. So the challenge was, how do we set the wider future context? Now, this was addressed with a scenario exercise to explore how the visible trends, so there's one connection to the here and now, to what we were seeing at the operational level, but to explore how these visible trends and the weak signals, the radical ideas, when we bring them together, might influence the evolution of the wider market. Now, the scenarios in themselves were fascinating and creative. And we actually created a kind of a series of mock-up sort of economist-type magazines to explore what was going on in these scenarios. But the point I want to make here is, not only was the content really interesting, creative, and useful, but the process experience was equally valuable. And I'll explain why. So the trend work we did initially was really instrumental in exposing senior colleagues to new trends, to existing trends and their implications across different functions. Because the bigger our organizations are, perversely, the more focused we are on our own functions. And one of the things that this exercise did was expose senior colleagues to how other functions were experiencing the same trends. It also then started to tease out how some of the new ideas were starting to emerge into the marketplace, but were having an impact, a different impact, or a similar impact perhaps, across different functions and across different brands. Now, one of the biggest challenges, as I'm sure many of us have found, was actually to keep the connection between the foresight work and the current priorities. this was absolutely crucially important for an affiliate organization where so much strategic direction and strategic control is handed down from the corporate center. So the exercise was designed around those pieces that the affiliate had strategic control over, and it was based within the context of the strategic planning process, which set a 5-year planning horizon. Now, as a futurist, I would have loved us to have gone 10, 15 years, but there's a risk then that we break the connection with the organization and where the organization is. So I just want to make 3 other points about this approach. And the first is that management and leadership of the process, although it was handled through the strategy group, we got senior advocacy for the exercise, and that was really critically important. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, actually, that advocacy was universal across all of the leadership team, the directors and their leadership team members. But what we did was we invited the directors and senior leaders to attend. We didn't compel them. And the reason for that is we then got the energized people in the room. They were the right people to have within this exercise because they were motivated to learn about how these trends were impacting the organization right now, how they might evolve into the future, and what that might do to the wider marketplace we were operated in. So I think if I kind of characterize the example there, that was characterized by the type of engagement that we did, both about the content and about the process. There was also collaboration, particularly about the way that we developed the content, from making sense of the trends through to identifying the driving forces and writing, designing, compiling the scenarios. We did work across these 3 time horizons in parallel. So we paid attention to the operational trends, the things that the organization's tactics were already responding to, as well as looking for growth, doing a bit of kind of predictive analysis, almost some extrapolation, but then also looking at the longer term, the wild cards, the developments, the ideas. And I think that led us to a position where we were able to develop advocacy for foresight as a critical component around how we led the organization through strategy development.
So let me say try and pinpoint what I'm hearing here is that you were able to engage with people working with more or less all those 3 different planning horizons. You were able to engage with people who were sort of a positive towards the very concept of the work. And I suppose one of the crucial things here is also not the scenario works per se, but connecting it with action, because I'm sure we all agree that foresight per se, for foresight's sake only, is of little value unless you're really able to connect with more or less actual strategic decision making, actual efforts of innovation, and actual efforts of one's daily work. Unfortunately, there are nasty examples about that. Sorry, Steve, go ahead. Anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah. What I was going to say is the action piece, I agree, is really, really important. And one of the things that these scenarios contributed to was the creation of an experimental spin-off arm that went into the marketplace to develop and deliver service that would support product penetration into the marketplace, but it wasn't just to do with products. So that was an example as to how that exercise contributed to real action and activity.
Indeed. And about those, bad examples, at least unfortunately, I've been sometimes a part of, is that, if working with scenarios, is that you first choose to invest in the creation of scenarios in that work, but then either of the 2 happens. One, you do that as a one-off effort, to serving that 1 year's strategic planning process. Let's see how this works out, and then you forget about it. You don't go following up on it. You don't do that continuously, and so on and so on. And the other, say, bad practice is, I'd say, you paint the scenarios at too high a level, where both these problems, you either do it one-off quickly, more or less quickly for that one-time effort, or you paint the scenarios at a too high a level, both them result into the same problem. They fail reaching a level, a level of detail that could actually be used for connecting those scenarios with real action, and people just lose their motivation into that work. That's just what I've seen. So any additional advice or points of view from you, Steve, on how to really connect this foresight work, be it with scenarios or other types of foresight working methods? Any additional points of view on how to really connect this with action?
Yeah. So there are four themes that I have in mind, and some of them will connect to some of the things that I've already said. But so the first one that comes to mind is advocacy, is developing the idea of foresight. Whatever the chosen tools, I think is absolutely crucial. And what we have to do, I think, is make the argument for foresight clear. And that's about not only being clear in our articulation of what's in it for the company, for the organization, but actually what's in it for the individual leaders in the organization, even the individual leader that you're having this conversation with. I think that's really important. And we'll get a little bit later into some ideas that I have about, kind of organizations and individuals. So the advocacy should be clear about what we're doing, how we're doing it, the investment and the return on that investment that we'll get. So advocacy, developing this advocacy at senior levels across the organization is absolutely crucial. Doesn't necessarily have to be at the very top level, could be director level less one, because very often it's at that level where there's greater scope to be creative and innovative. The second is to be very aware of resistance. And I'm sure we can all think of examples within our organizations where we've come across resistance. And resistance at the very top is obviously a very big problem, but it doesn't have to be terminal. We actually have to go where the energy is, develop some really good practice, develop some really good projects about foresight, and take the benefits back to hopefully challenge that resistance. So don't fight the resistance. Go to where the energy is and consider how we explore an uncertain and rapidly evolving future. Bring those people together to start to think about foresight projects, how we use it, demonstrating the relevance and the value of foresight work. But importantly, I think we have to pay attention to how we naturally respond to uncertainty and how that plays into resistance. Because there's a sense of uncertainty about the future that actually generates a strong threat or alert response in our limbic system. So it's natural for us to resist uncertainty. Our brain detects something is wrong, and our ability to focus on other issues diminishes. So our brain doesn't like uncertainty. It's kind of a type of pain, and it's to be avoided. Certainty, on the other hand, feels rewarding, and we tend to steer towards it. Why do most of our organizational processes and the things that we communicate to people inside and outside our organization talk about all the positive things? Even our kind of strategic planning processes are generally set up to emphasize the positive, to emphasize the certainty. So there's a really interesting conflict between the reality, the increasing reality of our uncertain future, and the comfort and confidence of certainty. And the only thing that's certain is what's happened. So I think it's really helpful for us to understand and show that we understand that challenge to the organization, particularly to the leaders within it. I think, of course, scope is really important. Asking the right foresight question, be clear about the scope, how the foresight will be used, how it connects to the organization's current reality. And I kind of talk about this in the context of a piece of elastic. So I always felt that when I was working inside an organization in foresight, there was a piece of elastic between me and the rest of the organization. And I could stretch it to kind of help them stretch their thinking. If I went too far and the elastic broke, then I'd be disconnected for the organization and no one would pay any attention to it. So I think it's really important that we stretch the elastic almost to breaking point, but make sure it doesn't break. And the fourth thing I want to talk about is change. And I've been exploring foresight in the context of change leadership for a year and a half now. And I think change is a really interesting way to help operationalize foresight. So in change programs, the question I pose is, how often do we explore the future? So do the change programs we see and experience seek to change the past or the present? And how well does that really set us up for an increasingly uncertain future? And I think what's really fascinating is what potentially happens when we embed foresight into change programs. And as I say, I think this is a really fascinating way to operationalize the adoption of foresight, because most organizations are undergoing some form of change. And I think building foresight into change programs helps build flexibility, agility, resilience. It helps us do that by exploring plausible scenarios. And I think that's crucial for future growth and survivability. And over the last few months, I've been developing a concept called leading change with foresight for growth. And I've been working with a colleague to test these ideas with the University of Reading's Henley Business School. And we've actually started to roll out a leadership development program for clients, focusing on embedding change with foresight methodology.
You've embedding change with foresight, embedding foresight with change and change programs for that matter. In your mind, does this have a does this thinking have an impact on say scoping of such change programs to start with? I mean, are you saying that instead of say outlining and scoping change programs focused on solving subject matter questions, are you referring that you should instead or in parallel or what also scope the programs to include development of organizational mindsets and skills related to foresight and futures thinking? What does it say about the scoping of change programs?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really pertinent question. And I think the subject matter topic should always be at the heart of change programs. If we're not clear about the subject matter, the topic of the change, the reason for the change, then actually we're going to miss the target. So that should always remain at the core of the business case. If I just very briefly lay out how I think foresight plays a role in change programs. I think typically what we do, we have a change agenda. One of the things that we do early on is we set a change vision. I think that change vision should be both informed and challenged by foresight. We then take that insight, develop the change program, whichever model we want to use, and eventually we decide to develop some change plans. And I think that's where foresight comes in as well, because it allows us to challenge those change plans. Are the change plans broad enough? Do they focus on the future or do they focus on the here and now? If they don't, is there something about the change we're setting up we need to go back and address? So those are the two places typically within a change process I see foresight playing a significant role, in the visioning piece and in the change plan development piece. But having said that the subject matter should always be front of mind, I think we should be looking for these added benefits that you alluded to just then, Panu. So we should be looking to build change programs, for example, that are human-centric. Let's focus on what happens to people within the context of change. I have a very strong belief that that's one of the things we should be using foresight for as well. We should be developing human-centric futures, and we should be developing human-centric change. We should really understand the organizational context, not the organizational context as it's been or as it is, but also as it might be in the future. I think engagement is absolutely critical. Engaging colleagues as deeply and as often as possible. Explore the reason for the change and the nature of the future within the context of the marketplace that the organization seeks to operate in the future. But I think critically, all of this, the adoption of foresight in change, the creation of change programs, how we change, is actually a leadership choice. So let me go back to a basic premise here. If the world is increasingly subject to significant change, our focus is often on exponential technology development. But actually, when we look, political, economic, social change, they're all happening at breakneck speed. Then if we look at this range of future forces, dial in the impact of the pandemic, then actually we're looking at an accelerating impact of these different trends on life, society, and business. And that's adding to our collective sense of complexity and uncertainty. And I said earlier on, I'd come back and mention uncertainty. And I'm doing that several times because I think that's particularly important. That's why I think foresight should be playing such a significant role in leadership. So in that context, I think that's why we should be putting foresight at the heart of change programs. We need to be exploring the nature of change and the human face of change. And that's about adopting a new mindset that helps us accept and embrace exponential change. Going back to what I said earlier on about how we experience uncertainty through our limbic system, that's a real challenge. But with more than an eye on plausible, multiple technology-centric futures, I think enabling a more human-centric future is one of those things that embracing foresight in change helps us do. We can't achieve a future-fit change without foresight, I don't believe.
Indeed, indeed. I tend to recollect that you authored, or at least co-authored, a couple of books even on the topic of human centricity and human-centric futures and societies. But let's not go there today. I'm not saying that. We don't have the time for that. But perhaps to clarify something or to add on to what you just said about that human centricity. Now, different planning horizons in a given organization, different working roles of individuals, and so on and so on. Different individuals, we know this more or less as a fact. Different individuals are different. Their levels of openness and their levels of perhaps capabilities also about thinking about new alternative futures and all of that. These differ. Look at neuroscience, look at psychology, look at common sense and experience. That different individuals tackle the questions of potential futures really differently. So my question to you, there's also a question from the audience, but let's get to that in just a few minutes. My question is, and I suppose you also talk about that sort of organizational mindsets, organizational skills and capabilities of working with foresight. So my question then is, we're starting to wrap up here. My question to you is how then to take into account these different mindsets of individuals that they have, sort of a more or less inbuilt in their very nature. Any advice or thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'm always fascinated the way that we use the word organization and then fit almost anything just after it, because I don't think an organization as such has a mindset. A mindset exists within each influential individual within an organization or an entity. And I think when we recognize enough people exhibiting certain characteristics, certain behaviors, certain skills, we might call it an organizational mindset. But I think the reality is that we have a plethora of different mindsets within any given organization. But with that in mind, there are a number of things that come to my mind. I think we need to be open to different perspectives and different ideas. And most organizations actually do have this difference. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to change our own mindset to embrace the difference, because there's real power, there's interest, there's creativity, there's innovation in different mindsets. And that potentially includes those that might be exhibiting resistance. I think the foresight process, especially when we start to talk about scenarios, should be collaborative, another way to develop advocacy as well. Part of that collaboration process, I think, is about effective facilitation of the process of the sense making and the content creation. An effective facilitation is about bringing people in. It's about supporting the collaborative nature of the work. And I think our engagement should be genuine with the participants, again, in the process. So, you know, open the box, bring people in. I'm mixing my metaphors there, but bring people in to show them the process design, to give them comfort that actually what we're talking about when we use Foresight is a structured process that helps us think about things that are inherently unstructured and uncertain. And I think that engagement with participants should be not only about the process, but also about content development. Where necessary, let's provide training to build understanding and develop capability, even if that just allows people to ask the right questions about Foresight rather than actually conducting it. And you mentioned a couple of times, and we've spoken about how we link Foresight to organizational priorities and to the organizational action and activities that it's undertaking. That's absolutely critical. I think also let's not kind of avoid the existing organizational processes and look for opportunities to build Foresight into those. I mean, I've spoken about change programs, but strategy development is an obvious one, but brand development, how can we use scenarios in the context of developing brand strategy into the future? Organizational development, leadership development, all these things, I think, are places and opportunities for us to think about Foresight and how we develop capabilities within the individuals within the organization. And then hopefully when we see enough, it potentially becomes an organizational capability.
Indeed, which from my point of view, at least, also sort of goes back also onto how do you really organize for Foresight, whether this is a standalone team somewhere or whether the work is embedded in existing core processes, perhaps facilitated by a core team and so on. So let's not go in deeply into that right now because we're running out of time soon. But very quickly, Steve, there's a question from the audience actually here before wrapping up our main session here. There's a quick question related, and the question says, who should own Foresight in an organization? Any quick comments on that one?
Yeah, it's like that comes up quite a lot, doesn't it? And in an ideal world, the CEO would own Foresight within the organization, but bizarrely, the CEO, as I'm sure some people around this virtual table already know, is often involved in very operational and tactical things as well.
Although, remember, I think we've got a few CEOs in the audience as well, but that aside.
Yeah. So I'm sure they'll recognize this. So I think Foresight should be owned at a very senior level within the organization, and that may differ between different organizations. My experience, I found it fits naturally, and I'm sure most people would agree, it fits naturally with strategy. But I think it's how the strategy group within the organization manages its activity, its process within the context of the organization. So does the strategy group support cross-functional strategy working groups? How does the strategy group engage with different functions across the organizations around strategic planning and futures work? So I think it's about how those resources are deployed and the remit the strategy group has from the leadership team, from the directors, to go about its work. And in my experience, some kind of internal consulting role is often really good for that, because that allows that group to go where the energy is and actually kind of build advocacy across the organization to encourage
connect with multiple work streams and processes, if you will, right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
Indeed. Steve, thank you so much for. I think I'm sort of mindful of the time with the question and perhaps a slightly slow start. Let's not go over time. So for now, thank you for all those inputs you've already provided. Perhaps a quick summary, your top three key takeaways of this all. What does it mean, or what's your main recommendations to individuals, to organizations that are working towards that new skill set and new mindset of Foresight?
Yeah, I think that, so three things. Firstly, explicitly adopt Foresight as a critical leadership skill. And I think intuitively we know it's important, but is it part of the leadership framework that we have in our organizations? And remember that the ability to facilitate the development of organizational culture that builds mindsets and capability to imagine and experiment our way to the future through foresight and scenario thinking is critical. So look at those skills and explicitly build it into the leadership skill set that becomes a standard in the organization. Develop advocacy. So the second, develop advocacy for foresight in the organization, but don't fight the resistance. Go where the positive energy is for exploring the future, and use that positive energy to foster a mindset of willingness and ability to explore, make sense of, and become more agile and resilient in the face of our increasingly uncertain future. And actually, has there ever been a better time than right now to try to develop advocacy about how we address and make sense of potential disruptions in our future? And thirdly, look for opportunities to deploy Look for opportunities to deploy foresight to make informed decisions that we need to make now, future fit. So look for clear connectivity to where the organization is today. So we're connecting with the organization's reality. And we do that by embedding foresight into operational processes as well as strategic ones, things like change programs, organizational development programs, potentially even learning and development programs. So those are the three, really. So think about looking for opportunities, developing advocacy, and explicitly adopting foresight as a critical leadership skill.
Oh, indeed. Which, from my point of view, sort of closes the circle, closes the loop back where we started from. That first of all, you need to have that buy-in of your key people in leadership positions, of key people in different actual day-to-day processes, right? And you only via that ideology and related organization and sharing of roles and responsibilities, you can really only achieve that possibility of really having impacts of your foresight work.
Yeah.
Now, what a great closing to that, Steve. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, sharing your thoughts, experiences, examples. This is where the main session and presentations then stop.